Hello, my name's Alan Morrison. I'm Professor of Law and Finance at the Saïd Business School, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the second of this year's Centre for Corporate Reputation webinars. The Centre is concerned with reputation, trust, and other forms of social evaluations, and it attempts to understand how those evaluations are formed in business and social life, and in turn, how they help to construct and to enable that life. At this time of year, the Centre usually brings together leading researchers for a major academic symposium. This year, we're replacing that symposium with two webinars. The first webinar, which occurred yesterday, examined geopolitics. The second, today, is concerned with global business and civil society in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. Some of the questions that we hope to address are: how have organisations and civil society collaborated to meet the challenges presented by the pandemic, and what can we learn from our experiences? Will organisations change the way that they operate in the wake of the crisis? How will activists and other civil society actors re-engage with pressing global issues like the environment? And what's happened to the place of business in society as a result of the pandemic? Has it changed at all? Is business more or less trusted? Do we have any reason to revise our views on the role that business plays? These are difficult questions, but we're lucky that we have two very distinguished speakers to help us tease out some of the answers. Rose Marcario stepped down from her role as CEO of the outdoor clothing company Patagonia in June of this year. She joined Patagonia in 2008 after 15 years in private equity, and during her time at Patagonia, the firm's profits tripled. Moreover, under Rose's leadership, Patagonia worked very hard to be more environmentally friendly, for example, by reducing waste and excess packaging. The firm is known for discouraging excessive consumption of its own products as well as of other resources. Patagonia under Rose was a social activist. For example, it funded a documentary about dam removal, and it expressed a serious commitment to the maintenance of public lands. Rose has also given vocal and practical support to on-site childcare in organisations, which she views as critical in ensuring that women are represented at the highest levels of the organisation. Rose is now a member of the Board of Trustees at Naropa University. Rose, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for joining us. Kumi Naidoo is a South African human rights and environmental activist. He was formerly International Executive Director of Greenpeace International and Secretary General of Amnesty International. He became the first global ambassador for Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity in June of this year. Kumi has a doctorate from this university and is an honorary fellow of Magdalen College. He's got 3 honorary doctorates from other universities and is also a professor of practice at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. Kumi is known for his activism in the fight against apartheid in South Africa, for his environmental and climate work, and for his criticism of bodies like the World Economic Forum. Kumi, thank you for being here. I'm really very happy that you can give us your input today. We're going to run the webinar as follows. In a moment, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to make some opening remarks. If you have questions, please put them into the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of the window. Please don't use the chat box, which we're trying to reserve solely for technical questions. When our speakers have had a chance to respond to each other and to anything else that arises from their opening remarks, I'll pose audience questions to them. We'll cover as many of those questions as we possibly can, but we're going to try and finish the webinar promptly at 5 o'clock. I'm going to start by asking Kumi to make some remarks on today's topics. Kumi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan. Greetings, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I hope it's okay for me to start in an Oxford panel with a poem that captures my perspective written during lockdown. It's called "We're all desperate to get back to normal, but should we?" Normal. What an average word. So uninspired, it's actually absurd. In a time when we have been forced to change our ways, to pause and isolate and dream of better days, that we'd ever yearn for the world of yesteryear, a world so divided, so fragmented by fear. It's mind-boggling at best that we might just blow Mother Nature's test, longing for the same madness that put us in this global sadness. Of me first and screw you, and buy 4 for the price of 2. Surely, getting back to normal can't be our aim. After all the sacrifices, death and pain. Yes, this pandemic has brought us to our knees, cutting jobs and highlighting inequality. Our leaders are exposed and the broken systems they have imposed are now obviously not making any sense. So why do we obsess and resist what needs to be? The end to these failed economic schemes and political machines that weaken and divide, leaving only the elite satisfied? No, we have to be better than this. And if not for ourselves, we must for our kin, our children and their children, and the ones after them. Thankfully, our youth has far more motivation to take action and end years of frustration by breaking down the walls we have created and the inequality that is so utterly outdated. So now, what are you going to do? Let's hope it is something substantially new to keep building post-corona a human existence that is far from over. Learning from our lessons, respecting all persons, especially our healthcare and essential workers, who were invisible to many of us before this pandemic, and never again, lest we forget, what and who really matters, even when all hope scatters, because this tragedy surely must be our big opportunity to look beyond what has always been and build a world that we can all thrive in. Thank you for allowing me that indulgence. After the 2008 and 2009 global financial crisis, when many were saying we would never go back to normal, what we saw was an approach by those with power of system recovery, system maintenance, and system protection. When what was needed then and what was needed now was system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. When we hear the words build back better, we have to be very clear that we are talking about quite a large continuum of what constitutes build back better. It could include marginal incremental tinkerings on the one hand, or it could include potentially fundamental systemic and structural change that is critically needed if we are to avert catastrophic climate change, deliver a world of greater equity, address some of the historical past of racial injustice, slavery, and so on. If we are to move forward, we have to be willing to now say that to get out of the moment where we are is not simply going to be a question of incremental improvements. So within that context, I want to evoke the words of Martin Luther King speaking in the mid-60s when he said, there's a very dominant term in modern child psychology called maladjusted. Now, all of us want to live a well-adjusted life and not suffer from schizophrenia or other illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so unjust and immoral that good, decent people should refuse to be well-adjusted to. He goes on to say, I never intend to adjust myself to racial discrimination, religious bigotry, and so on. And on the economy, he says, I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty, in an affluent society. If that was valid as a statement in the mid-60s in the United States, I would argue that that is 1,000 times more valid in the United States as it is all around the world today. We have normalized an immoral and extreme level of economic inequality backed up by outdated measurements of wealth. For example, I draw your attention to the book by Lorenzo Fioramonti on GDP, gross domestic product, or gross domestic problem, the world's most largest most powerful number, because if we look at how we measure wealth today on the basis of if any economic activity, whether it is forests being chopped down, whether it is workers who are living 1 year on ships catching tuna in the Pacific, all of that is put on the positive side of GDP. We need fundamental thinking. Now, I conclude by saying, for business leaders, for civil society leaders, for government leaders, we have to move from the reality of the present to something much different. But for far too long, those in leadership, when we get into a deep crisis, seem to want to come out of it with just the most marginal improvements, when what is crying for right now is a fundamental rethinking of our economic system, our energy system, our agriculture system, our transport system. That is what the COVID pandemic has exposed. All of these systems have been shown to be lacking, and let us hope that the leadership that comes out of this moment will be laden with moral courage, because that is what it is called for right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kumi. Before we move to Rose, can I ask you one question about your remarks? You've suggested that the world needs a radical rethink, that current systems of power and influence are arranged in a way that reinforces quite severe systematic problems. And you've said that we should come out of this crisis and try to address them. And I'd just like to push back a little bit and ask whether there is any reason a priori to believe that we will, to believe that this crisis, which is a crisis of public health, is likely actually to push people, push institutions and civil society in the direction you'd like it to go?
I had a disagreement on this question with Mary Robinson on a panel recently, somebody who I agree with all the time, where she was very optimistic, saying that there's no way we can go back to the situation in 2008, 2009. However, the reality is, right now, if I had £1,000 to bet, I would be betting that, in fact, the most likely scenario is that we will go back to business as usual. The thing that gives me optimism, though, is that we are facing now a perfect storm, a convergence of multiple crises, where those with power have been shown not to have real meaningful solutions, and so on. And given that reality, on the other hand, we are seeing the massive mobilization of citizens, and we are seeing those struggles being connected, not struggles that are being waged solely in isolation. And for all of those reasons, while it is far from a done deal, I want to believe that we have a better chance in a moment of crisis, but also in a moment of resistance that we have never seen before, that humanity might find the courage to make the big decisions that we need to make to move the world to greater sustainability and greater justice.
Okay, thank you. Rose, would you like to give us your opening thoughts?
Yeah, Alan, thank you for having me here. Kumi, great to hear your thoughts. And I believe that great crises is the only thing that creates great change. But thank you for having me here. I hope everyone listening is safe and well during these times. Because I was CEO of a responsible brand in the middle of COVID, I can share a little bit about that experience. Like any international company, we experienced the impacts of the pandemic in China and Europe and all across the globe before the lockdown happened in the US. And we were making supply contingency plans, we were changing our financial plans, but we could have never imagined that the lockdown would continue and be so pervasive, and the impacts that we saw in the US would be so far reaching. We also could never have imagined the politically divisive climate could put our employees at risk simply by asking someone to wear a mask during a global pandemic, or our retail store traffic would stop almost completely, or that the impacts of the crisis would have on our wholesale partners and our supply chain. And within a few weeks, with the exception of our digital business, things came to pretty much a standstill during the lockdown. And of course, all this is happening in the face of so many social justice issues coming to a head in the US. And the way I framed it for our company is that we had to think about this crisis in 3 phases: stabilize, recover, and reimagine the business, because it became clear very quickly that things would never go back to the way that they were before. And while most companies have literally been in survival mode as they've focused, they're focusing on trying to keep their business alive, they're also focusing on their employees and customers' health and well-being, and making literally life and death decisions every day. In general, unless you had an essential business, most businesses have seen their revenues drop by at a minimum 30% or greater. I'm using US statistics, but with smaller businesses that might only have one channel or one shop, they're being impacted 100%. So retailers and any company that was slow to adopt or invest in digital transformation found themselves redirecting their funds and their energy to digital and other solutions. But the reality is, with those kinds of operating losses, most companies are facing inevitably that there'll be permanent job losses and permanent hits to the economy that will take time, retraining, investment, and policy changes to recover from. This pandemic has taught us a lot about resilience, but it's also exposed vulnerabilities in the system meant to protect us. The social safety net, our healthcare infrastructure, our general infrastructure, our democracy. The lockdown amplified how close the average family in the US was to food and housing insecurity. In business, we struggled with layoffs and furloughs and questioned our footprint on the planet. Is it really necessary to fly to meetings around the world or trade shows when a Zoom call works just fine? Are the hours spent commuting necessary in our digital age? Do businesses need expanding office infrastructure, or is it better to have a distributed workforce? We're discovering new ways of working. And in Los Angeles, where I live, I saw the skies become bluer and the air become cleaner just a week after lockdown. Nature regenerating herself from our daily damage. We saw our own consumption habits laid bare. What are real necessities and what is just mindless consumption, putting more pressure on our already overburdened planet? I believe the business can be the greatest agent for change during this time, but some businesses need to step up and stop being evil and greedy and move toward a more just form of capitalism. Like every good idea, capitalism needs to evolve into a multi-stakeholder model that includes people and the planet if we're all going to survive and have a healthy and happy life. In the US, we have 60 of the largest US companies who paid zero taxes on almost $80 billion of income. That's 2018 data, but using a corporate tax rate, that's $20 billion stolen from schools, hospitals, infrastructure, health clinics, public assistance. Instead of stock buybacks and corporate greed, what about people and the planet and healthy infrastructure? Shareholder primacy and the quarterly obsession of the public markets has been an unmitigated disaster. It's created the largest inequality gap in history. It's destroying our planet. It's hurting workers. It's a suicidal mission of the very rich investor class who it benefits and believes that they'll be immune from it all. But if COVID has taught us anything, it's that the web of life is interconnected. Social justice, climate action, global health, healthy business, profitable business. This won't be the last global challenge that we face. But companies must take their responsibility for social and ecological systems, which are more inclusive and just. This is the time for business to recognize we must evolve if we're going to survive and make a better world. So thanks, Alan. Those are my comments. I'm looking forward to a deeper discussion.
Thank you, Rose. I'm going to come back to you with a question that's very similar to the one I asked of Kumi. Given a need for a realignment of business organizations and a re-understanding of what business is for, I wonder if it's realistic to expect that right now. We're in a situation where the number of people out of work is exploding. And as a consequence, presumably, the balance of power between what we sometimes refer to as capital and what we sometimes refer to as labor, presumably has shifted further towards capital. So if people with large blocks of capital want to behave as they always have done, presumably it's easier than it ever was. Is that not true?
I think that's true, but I also do think that there's an opportunity now to call those to account, to work on policy, to work in civil society, and to put pressure on those businesses, those resources of capital, to invest in workers, the economy, retraining. If we don't do that, I don't think this is going to be like 2008. This is a totally different animal that we're dealing with right now, with what I think will be much deeper permanent job loss. And so the systems need to change completely, I think, in order for us to have a world worth living in. It's certainly the case in the US. I mean, there's almost no social safety net in the US. and I can already see the impacts of that. The people that are becoming homeless because they can't afford back rent, the healthcare issues. These are all issues that are going to come to bear on civil society and already coming to bear on civil society. And we have a representative government. I think most people are feeling their representatives aren't doing anything right now that are really helping the average worker.
Okay, so we've got a few questions appearing in the Q&A box. Before we get to them, let me ask you both one question that's been exercising me, and I'm going to take advantage of my situation to get some expert opinions. One of the things that seems to me likely significantly to change is, and something that Rose has already touched upon, is the extent to which we all commute. So it seems likely that many large organizations will allow more people to work from home. And for sure, that presumably is a very good thing in terms of consumption of fossil fuels and that sort of thing. But I wonder if it might serve to worsen the sort of social fragmentation that we've seen lately. So many of our polities are strongly divided between people who have almost irreconcilable views who can't speak to each other. And if you never travel to work and you never mix with people who aren't like you and don't live in your suburb, I wonder if the consequence of that is further to deepen those divides. And if it is, what can business and what can civil society actors in general do about it? So why don't we start with you, Rose, and then get Kumi's thoughts on this point?
Yeah, Alan, I think when the lockdowns and those kinds of issues, when it's safe to get back together, my feeling about that is that people will still be getting together in offices and people that they work with, but it might look different. It might happen more regionally. It might happen in a corporate office, but there'll still be that connection. But it might not mean daily commuting. It might not mean that daily that need for that daily trek into the office. And the amount of fossil fuel that's burned just by those kind of commutes, it's staggering. So I think people will learn that companies will learn that not having to have all that infrastructure and be scaling all that infrastructure all the time will help them be more resilient and flexible too.
Okay. Kumi, what do you think? Will working from home fracture societies? Will it mean that the sort of affluent middle class never meet the people who do the dirty jobs? And is that something we can fix? You're muted, Kumi.
I beg your pardon. I wonder about the quality of the interactions that happen at the moment across class lines at the moment. I think the pandemic did actually break the invisibility of many people who are so critical for all our existence. And, when the term essential worker was used, it kind of brought a different sense of people who play roles that are critically important. Having said that, I do share your concern, Alan, that this could get worse. However, I don't think it's necessarily going to be an either or. I think what you'll probably get is much more flexible working arrangements where smart employers will allow lots of flexibility, but ensure that there is sufficient moments of interaction, because people will need the face-to-face interaction to do a whole bunch of things and so on. So I don't think it's going to be absolutely, be absolute, but I do think it is going to be a major, major adjustment. I think in the balance, I think overall it's good, because sadly, apart from looking at it from the employer point of view, if you look at it from the worker point of view, people spend far too many hours commuting all the time, getting to work, the levels of stress today that comes with commutes and so on. I think, there's also some public health benefits to reducing the level of traveling, not only climate benefits. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So some of the questions that are appearing in the Q&A box relate to the nature of stakeholder capitalism. So Michael Jensen and Will Harvey are both asking a question about this, and I had a related one myself. So let me try and package the three questions together. You both seem to be saying that an excessive emphasis on shareholders, or the shareholder primacy model, has resulted in dysfunctional economic behavior and dysfunctional social outcomes. And we see rhetoric about this from the Business Roundtable, from the World Economic Forum, from The Economist, Harvard Business Review. A lot of people are talking about stakeholder capitalism. So I guess there are a bunch of questions that arise here. One is, what does stakeholder capitalism actually look like? So Rose has said that capitalism needs to evolve. I'm very comfortable with that, but I wonder where you see it evolving, or is this, and a classic answer to this sort of evolutionary question is, it should just happen organically. Can it? Or do we actually need the intercession of the state to make this work? And do you think that we're going to see new groups of stakeholders emerging? So lots of questions. Rose, I'll start with you again. Why don't you tell us what you had in mind when you said that the model needed to change?
Well, I think we have examples of how to change the model. We have the benefit corporation model, which has taken hold in the US and around the world, which recognizes that a corporation should have, should measure other benefits to society, including, people, planet, its workers, its supply chain. So we have tools, we have legal structures. I think the issue now is really the public markets, the quarterly earnings grind, the idea that profit is the only measure of success. I mean, what happens now is that workers and citizens bear the external costs of corporations. If a corporation makes your water and air dirty and pollutes and denies climate change, that's gonna, the externalities of that are gonna affect individuals. So I don't think it's that hard. Really, it's about measuring those things. Business is really good about measuring things. It's a matter of putting those measurements and that framework in place. And like I said, it really already exists in a lot of the work of the benefit corporation movement, but it has to be adopted by the broader investor class. And we've seen, the Business Roundtable come out and make a statement, although we haven't seen much action from that statement. We're seeing some changes to the law that make it easier for public companies to become public benefit corporations. But this is sort of the movement that I see. It's really about measuring. It's measuring against a set of measures that all companies are measuring against. So it's impossible to greenwash. It's impossible to report on your own progress as being excellent when there's no one monitoring it or auditing it. But I don't think it's that, I mean, in my experience, it wasn't it's a false choice to say you can't make money and do good and also have multiple stakeholders, and those stakeholders being people and the planet in a very simple terms.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you on that, but I want to get Kumi's thoughts first. Kumi, would you like to weigh in on this question of how we get to a different form of stakeholder capitalism?
I think to keep the conversation flowing, I'll pick up on Rose's last comment. I think the question is not so much about today anyway, it's not so much about whether in fact profit in itself is contested. I think it is the scale of profit taking, which is now, very much on the table. And if you look at it even in terms of, classical capitalism, the logic in the past was people deserved a big return on the capital that they were risking because they were risking their capital. Today, a lot of our business leadership are not risking their own personal capital, right? But they still get even higher returns on their services. Even, of course, we know, unlike your tenure, Rose, when people fail dismally, they still guaranteed, payments that workers in the factory can only dream about. So I think there's a question here that is about, unless we are thinking what is our economy for, right? The purpose of our economy should be to meet people's basic needs and to do that in a way that is just, fair, and a fair amount of equity in distribution. And we just have to acknowledge that we're far away from that. So and the interesting thing about this is how the business community responds to this. I've been going to the World Economic Forum at Davos for several years. And for the last 5-6 years, almost every year when you ask the CEOs to vote on what's the biggest problem in the world, they all vote for inequality. Every other year now, inequality is either 1, 2, or 3 in the list, right? And then when you have people suggesting that the taxation rate needs to go to 70%, as happened in one Davos that I attended, you had scoffing by the CEOs of the big companies, as if it's, and by the way, that's what AOC and some other Congress people in the US are calling for. And it was made to be sounded like such a ridiculous idea, when in fact, at one point in less than a century ago in the United States in the 30s, the taxation rate was 90% for the people right at the top. And so this is what I was trying to say, that we have adjusted to frameworks that we need to go back and fundamentally readjust. And I will just conclude by saying that I've argued elsewhere that the biggest pandemic, the biggest disease we actually face is not COVID, is a disease we can call affluenza. And affluenza is what I describe, and others do as well, as the pathological illness where people have been led to believe that a good, meaningful, decent life comes from more and more and more and more material acquisitions. The hard truth is that the poor and the suffering people around the world are the ones that are subsidizing the overconsumption of those of us who are in the middle classes and above, right? And that's just a sad reality that COVID has exposed. So if we are wanting to come out of it, apart from questioning who are the stakeholders in the ownership of the economy, we should also be asking what kind of products that are coming out of that economy, when in fact a lot of what's coming out is in fact those that contribute to human harm rather than human welfare. Thank you.
Okay, so you've both made a compelling case that something's wrong. It's certainly true there's a massive amount of inequality. It's probably true that our understanding of what constitutes a meaningful and flourishing existence is sometimes perverted. And Rose has correctly pointed out the enormous damage that externalities do in the economy. But a couple of our questioners, Marilyn Carver's asking this question, so is Marianne McIlvary, asking very similar questions. It is true that we can measure this stuff. And businesses are very good at measuring things, as you say, Rose. But two questions, I guess, arise. One is it in the best interest, measured according to the pathological vision that Kumi has in mind? Is it in their perceived self-interest to respond to these measurements or even to do them? And if it's not, how do we enforce behaviors? I mean, I want to get back to the question I asked at the beginning, really. Is there a role here for a changed political system or for political engagement in business at a level that we haven't seen before? Or can we expect business to fix these problems on its own? Let's go in the reverse order this time. Kumi, what about political engagement? Do we actually need something other than, I mean, there are responsible businesses, but there are irresponsible businesses. Do we need non-business actors sometimes to engage?
Of course we need, I mean, you know, just as we say, politics is too important to be left to politicians, the economy is much too important to be left to the business community on its own. But the problem we have in most countries around the world today is that, you know, the ideal role of a government should have been a mediator between different interests in society, right? Today we have a situation where far too many of our governments are disproportionately not simply influenced, but disproportionately owned by very powerful economic interests. And this, you know, is more extreme in countries like Russia, but I would say that you see it, shades of it far too dominant in far too many places around the world. So, you know, within that context of the dominance of those kinds of tendencies, I'm very much of, you know, if you would pardon me, just taking you back to this measurement question, and we take it as a given that we can measure everything, right? And there is a quote that is incorrectly attributed to Einstein, which says, not everything that counts can be measured, and not everything that can be measured counts. And I think for actually understanding the situation of the human condition now, we need to actually recognize that for far too long, we have been unable, unwilling, or completely negligent in not making the kinds of investments of measuring the right things at the right time and so on. And so right now, yes, there's a lot of conventional measurement we do, but I don't think that it tells us of how deep a crisis we are in at the moment.
Okay. Rose, how do you feel about more active intervention and regulation? Is it necessary, or is it going to be more damaging than good?
I think it's totally necessary. I mean, look, everything has to come together, right? Government, NGOs, activism. I mean, think of the role activism has played in, you know, in the last few years. I mean, business, civil society. I mean, very simple things like, you know, businesses paying their fair share of taxes. I mean, when those numbers that I gave you for 1 year, I mean, just think those have accrued year after year after year. And that's all funding for civil society and civil infrastructure. It's just gone to line the pockets of very few investors, you know, and it's an unfair, unlevel playing field. And so you need government, you need policy. And I think what's happened, you know, I can speak in the US government for sure. I mean, what's happened is the worst interests, you know, fossil fuel industry, pharmaceutical industry, they've driven a lot of government and policies. The good guys, the good actors, the companies that are trying to balance profit, people, and the planet, they need to speak up and have a louder voice and make themselves known. And so there needs to be a level of corporate activism as well.
So are you proposing that corporations should be active in attempting to influence government to be more interventionist, to force corporations to do the right thing?
I am. I mean, I think that most companies that care about these issues and care about their employees, they understand that these inequities end up coming to bear in some form. You know, whether it's their employees can't afford housing, they can't afford health care, they are unable to you know, afford basic necessities. I think that I don't think it's about being more interventionist. I think it's about evolving capitalism in such a way that it levels the playing field. And right now we're in a crisis where more investment, more retraining, more cooperation is needed. Unfortunately, in the US, everything is so polarized that it's kind of impossible to get everything done. You know, we have a head of the Senate that calls himself the Grim Reaper when it comes to legislation. I mean, this is not the kind of environment that we need to get out of this crisis.
So there's a role for corporate activism, although I guess if corporations all want to do the right thing, they don't need to be regulated. So there are complicated problems to tease out here. It might be
but they're being measured on one thing, Alan. I mean, most of them are being measured on one thing, the big guys. They're only being measured on EPS.
Right. So they need to engage in activism to try and ensure that something else is important from a measurement point of view. Kumi, is corporate activism enough? Edmund Oppong, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Edmund, is asking whether we needed something more than just corporate activism, whether we actually need a new model of representative democracy. So is there a need for systems that give citizens more power? Because Rose has pointed to the fact that government can sometimes be captured by economic interests.
No, I'd fully agree there with Rose. Not only sometimes, I think right now it's more the norm than otherwise. And so in terms of new energies that need to be brought to bear, we cannot. So when we look at the things that need to be fixed with regard to our political system, let's be blunt about it. We got a real problem today where many people in the world have lost faith in their political systems, from the United States to Australia and everywhere in between. So there is a real challenge of how do we build integrity back into those election systems and so on, so that people have an incentive and have trust in those systems. And let me just say that you cannot do that by just keeping the system going. I mean, the fact that Donald Trump could get elected yet again because of an archaic ruling that was necessary at a different point of time, where 3 million or even 4 million more people could vote for him, vote for his opponent, from an obvious thing like that, that breeds sort of cynicism. And then when we look at what's needed, of course, in the current moment of crisis, and let me just say that, I'm often a voice of, gloom and doom in a way. and sometimes I'm reminded that, Martin Luther King's famous speech was not, I have a nightmare, it was, I have a dream. But it's a very difficult moment of leadership for all of us. How do you find the right balance at saying, on the one hand, right, that the scientists told us in October 2018 that we got 10 years or 12 years to get emissions to peak and start coming down before we were on an irreversible path to runaway catastrophic climate change, right? We all, accept that intellectually at one level. And then when the implications of what that means hits us, it's just too much to deal with, and a cognitive dissonance kicks in. So therefore, to conclude, my answer is absolutely it's going to include a whole range of other things. It's going to include, if activism is saying it cannot be business as usual to business, I would say activism must also be saying to itself, it cannot be activism as usual as well. We need to be thinking, for example, of new ways of engaging new constituencies. For example, I think activism as completely neglected, for example, the role of arts and culture and what power that can bring to changing people's attitudes and so on. And at the end of the day, we can talk about systems, institutions, and so on. I think, and this might sound very romantic, but if we do not have substantial numbers of people in the world sharing the same values and seeking the same justice and respecting it for everybody else, institutions as they are today are robust and are self-interested, and they are resistant to change. The only way you're going to get it is by changing global public consciousness almost in a very fundamental way.
So there's a need for a bigger institutional change than simply, although not simply, than only within business. I want to get at a couple of very interesting questions that have come up in the Q&A about reputation in all of this, given that we are a centre for reputation. And they both strike me as touching on things that we've already talked about. The first comes from Anne Augustine. She points to a recent event where Oatly, which you may be aware makes plant-based milk, accepted a $200 million investment from Blackstone and were criticised for selling out to an investment company that had links to deforestation, for funding the Trump campaign and so on. things that Oatly at least did not align with. And they said that their goal here was to demonstrate to Blackstone that investment in sustainable business could be profitable. So there's a sort of dichotomy here, right? On the one hand, one wants to see businesses of all sorts, particularly responsible businesses, achieving funding. On the other hand, if you want to see institutional change, is it right and proper that those businesses should engage closely with institutions that are sometimes perceived as having complicated hinterlands? What do you think, Rose? How do you deal with this sort of situation?
Well, I think two things. One is that there are plenty of good, profitable private companies that choose not to go into the public market because they don't want to be bound by, the institutional investors' point of view of what's good for their business. So there's plenty of those companies out there, and they don't struggle with the question of, they're not looking at just EPS. They're looking at the long-term value of their company and the experience of their employees and suppliers. I think when companies, I don't think it's wrong for good companies to enter into the public markets, but I think they have to do it with a mindset that they're going to change it. And if they're not doing it with the mindset of they're going to change it, that means either enter that market as a public benefit corporation or enter that market with certain disclosures in their offering documents that say what they stand for, then I think it's just kind of creating more of the same. And I think founders and people that are selling their companies into the market have to think about that. They might just, want to cash out and want the capital too. I mean, it's more cynical, and I understand it. It happens, and people can do what they want with the assets they've built. I don't know what the particular case is with Oatly, but yeah, I mean, I think unless you're doing it differently right now, you're just sort of adding to the problem.
Kumi, do you have thoughts on this problem?
Yeah,
on this question?
I would share what Rose said, and I should say that right now, particularly from the global South, when people talk about a green economy, you would think that people who are progressive minded would just say yes, it's a good thing, and people have been saying for at least the last 5 to 10 years that hang on a minute, you have to be saying we want an inclusive green economy. Because if you don't put that there, if you just take all the current rules of business and you just put it in new industries, but you keep the same logic, the same culture, the same rules of profit taking and so on, you will end up with the kinds of contradictions that this example that you shared. And there are, of course, multiple such examples. But I think the way Rose put it would be, and let's be blunt about it, a very, very difficult conundrum. Right? It's a very difficult conundrum. None of us would want to be the CEO having to make that decision when you got so many different things to balance, right? So I say this with understanding, right? But yeah, thank you.
And a related question that comes from Rita Bota. Kumi, do you think that businesses engaging in social and environmental causes, when the businesses actually have themselves quite poor reputations for social and environmental issues, might actually serve to undermine those causes? Might it actually affect the reputation of the civil service organizations and the NGOs that are fighting for those causes? Is it sometimes actually, do you have to clean up your reputation before you can even play in this space? What do you think?
Well, there's a continuum of different ways in which civil society organizations engage with business, right? And you can think about it in conventional relationships, everything from a one-night stand to a marriage, right? And what you find business organizations very much like to say, the moment they have any connection with the civil society organization, they call it a partnership, right? Because it actually suits the need to enhance its relational and reputational capital. The reality today is businesses have to engage with civil society because for their survival, they cannot rely on conventional capital alone. the power of reputational and relational capital, especially for companies that need a consumer market, is absolutely critical. I can give you any number of examples from my time at Greenpeace, where if we were going after a particular company which had a big consumer base, that was the easiest campaigns to win, because we just appealed to the consumer base, and the consumer base appealed to the company saying, listen, you are not going to buy paper from newly deforested areas in the Sumatran forest in Indonesia, for example. So I think that the moment is a very tricky one, but there has to be a recognition that we can't change everything overnight, right? And we will have to take some risks. And I've been criticized a lot for being one of the civil society leaders who has said we have to engage with the business community, however much differences we have. I would argue, though, that for those engagements to be meaningful and purposeful moving forward, there are three principles that must be in place. One, recognize the power differentials in that relationship. Put it on the table, don't pretend like it's not there. Secondly, ensure that there is absolute transparency about what is being talked about, and that thirdly, the directly affected constituencies must be engaged, because even if it's a well-respected NGO, no company should take it for granted that they speak for everybody unless the community has a direct access into them. Okay. So some of those principles, I think, can enhance the way civil society engages with the business.
Okay, there's another very interesting, we have an awful lot of questions in the Q&A box. I'll make sure that you have to get a copy of the ones that we don't get to discuss, because they're very interesting. One that I would like to try and address briefly, so we'll get a couple more questions in before we run out of time. There's a question from Tuli Saran, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he says that he's making the point, I think, that reputation, we tend to use reputation as something that's desirable, right? So if you have a good reputation, if you have a strong reputation, that must be morally a good thing. But actually, if you have a strong reputation with appalling people, that might be a rather bad thing. And if that's the reputation you care about, it may actually inhibit your moral courage to speak out. So if you're a member of the Rotters Club and all your best friends are members of the Rotters Club, standing up and saying something uncomfortable about what needs to change is very hard. And that might actually be a serious social sheet anchor to change. Rose, what do you think? Is it hard for responsible business people to stand up and say responsible stuff to people who adhere to a system of shareholder primacy?
Well, I think without any question, it's much harder for public companies to do that, because their shareholders are investors, essentially, or funds, and they have the most influence over them. I mean, even though, and I know a lot of CEOs in the United States, and even though a lot of them might feel that, yes, we absolutely need to have ecological measures and social measures and measures of equality and inclusion, it's still the investor class that's running the show. So that's the class that has to change. And it won't change. I mean, Kumi makes a really great point about putting pressure on companies by reaching out to their consumer base. And I think that does cause business to change. I mean, I think about the students that force their universities to pull out of fossil fuel investments. There is a lot of power in civil society to help put pressure on these corporations and on the investor class of the people that hold the capital. I mean, that's really the issue. I mean, the CEOs of public companies don't really have a lot of power. They are beholden to their investors.
Okay, Kumi, briefly, because I've got one more question I want to get to. What do you think about this problem of potential ostracism of stepping up and saying the right thing? Is it a concern?
Well, that's what I meant earlier by saying that this is a moment of moral courage, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that people must be willing now to say things and explore ideas that are different, because, if, and this I believe is genuinely an Albert Einstein quote when he said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting to get different results. And we are at a moment where we have to be willing to have the courage to dream about whether we can do things differently. And let me tell you, my optimism is coming from young people everywhere in the world. Young people are like looking at what they're saying and saying, humanity can be much better than this. We refuse to accept that what you guys of my generation created is the best at humanity. So in that sort of sense, I think people shouldn't be too precious about their reputations. But on the other hand, there is a Dutch proverb that I would commend that people keep in mind, which says, trust comes on feet, but leaves on a horse. So in terms of deciding who you enter into partnerships and so on, you're going to have to make some really considered decisions.
Great, thank you. I like the foot horse story. I will rip that off. We have time for one more question if we answer it reasonably quickly. Something I don't think we've said much about is the role of employees in changing organizations from within. So we've talked a lot about market pressures. We've talked about civil society actors. We've talked about governments. Fiona has asked how important employee pressure is in changing organizations from within, i.e. employee-style activism. So Rose, why don't you go first, and then Kumi. What do you think, very briefly, please, if you can, well, within reason, briefly, how important is this, and is it feasible? Is employee activism a straight route to being fired?
No, I don't think it's a straight route to being fired. I think it's important, and it's happening more and more. I mean, we saw it a lot here in the U.S. with companies that were making that were making products for child detention centers, and their employees stepped up and said, we don't want to do this. This isn't comfortable for us. Or making, face recognition software for the military and fighting back about that. I mean, I think it's really important. I think it's going to be a really important part of making these serious changes to business and civil society, and more employees have to organize and step up on these issues that really matter. And that's my point of view on it. I welcomed it as a CEO. I love it when my employees came to me with their issues and called us out on things that were important to them and to society. And I think every CEO should feel that way.
Okay, Kumi, do you want to have the last word on this question?
I wish actually Rose had the last word. I just want 1,000% endorse everything that you just said there. And thank you, Rose, for your leadership and for setting an example that sadly is not as emulated as it should be in the world. But let me just say that one example, if it were not for the employees of Google, for example, Amnesty International would not have succeeded to have mobilized the pressure to defeat Google and Dragonfly, which was the project that Google was doing with the Chinese government. I can give you any number of examples like that. The tech workers, there's a institution, a network called Tech Workers Coalition, where tech workers in different tech companies actually get together, support each other, play this kind of role. And I fully support Rose in urging everybody who is an employee in any institution to recognize that before you're an employee, you're a citizen. And as a citizen, you have the responsibility to speak out against corruption, speak out against injustice, and so on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both for what's been a really enjoyable hour. I wish we had more time. I see that we have 18 questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to, so I'm very sorry if you asked one of those questions. They're all fascinating. We have questions here that we didn't talk about that I would have liked to talk about, concerning the taxation of multinational businesses, concerning zero-sum thinking in stakeholder management, concerning the need for conflict versus cooperation in what we're talking about as corporate activism, concerning the strength of the hold on power that entrenched interests have, and more. So there's a whole bunch of things we could talk about. It's clearly an important topic, but I think we've learned an enormous amount from your participation. So thank you once again for participating. It's been a real pleasure for me.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll leave it there. Thank you everyone for joining us, and bang on the hour, we're going to stop. Thank you.